All right, welcome to Second Look. This is a second look at what we talked about this past Sunday. My name is Todd Perkins, one of the pastors here at East North Church, and your primary source for what I hope to be a 15-minute or less recap of what we covered on Sunday. Now, the idea is that you're heading into group and probably going to revisit this concept, and this is just to refresh your memory. Probably a lot easier than listening to the entire message. I hope the entire message is a good thing, but those usually run, a good 40 minutes or more. And this is me trying to condense that information so it's a little more handy. Probably less detail, maybe a lot less illustrations. And at the end of the day, this is about getting our time managed and making sure that we get you guys the information you need. So I've got my coffee next to me. I've got my Bible pulled up. My notes are on my laptop. I'm ready to dive in, and this is happening, folks. We're still in Matthew 5. It's the first block of Jesus' teaching. If you remember, we've got Jesus sharing the Beatitudes. It's this countercultural, a little bit counterintuitive way of viewing what matters for God's kingdom. It's not quite built and structured the way that the world is built and structured. That's kind of the idea behind the Beatitudes. If we embrace God's way and begin to value what God values, then we'll be like salt and light in the world. And that's sort of the next section there, verse 13 through 16. And then there's an emphasis from Jesus that he's not tossing out the law. He's not saying that we're not going to have an attentive heart to pay attention to what the law requires. He's actually saying that it's absolutely necessary that we be aware of what God teaches and to not relax any of those expectations. And if anything, what Jesus goes on to do, as we talked about this past Sunday, is give examples in 6 different areas, 6 different laws. And I just think of it as Jesus raising the bar on the expectation. He's saying that it's not just the keeping of the law, sort of, we would refer to this as the letter of the law. It's, like, okay, so I didn't murder anyone today. I can pat myself on the back because I kept God's law. I did not murder. But what Jesus does, as if you remember, is he goes through these 6 sort of broad examples to just sort of like get our attention to help us know that none of us are innocent, that we're all culpable and responsible to follow God's law, maybe in a deeper way, certainly in this way, in a way that is more intense, more authentic, and more real than what the scribes and Pharisees practice. And that's the beginning of how this is sandwiched. That's the emphasis Jesus makes, that our righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. And then at the end, verse 48, he says that you must be perfect. That's what holiness looks like. Holiness doesn't just look like following the letter of the law or just the basic concept, but understanding the spirit of the law, what's underneath it. So he gives those examples. He talks about murder and lust and divorce and oaths and retaliation, and even the idea of who do we really love? Is it just our neighbor, or do we learn how to love our enemies? Like holiness would do those things. Now, for me, again, this isn't just about us understanding how to better sort of manage following these laws on our own. That's not the idea. God's not saying like, well, I didn't give you enough detail, and what I really need to do now is send Jesus in as a good teacher, and he's going to sort of like fill in the gaps on the details so that people will finally be obedient. And because at the end of the day, their obedience is what I expect and demand. The reality is that even when these details become more thorough and sort of the spirit of the law is revealed, which is what Jesus does, like with murder. He says, you've heard it said that you shall not murder, but I tell you, if you're angry, if you ever get upset, if you're ever frustrated, if there's something in you that harbors negative attitudes towards other people, then you're guilty of murder in your heart. What's going on in the heart and the soul is the same thing that goes on when you murder. So, great, you haven't murdered anyone, but Have you been angry and frustrated at someone, and even to the degree that you call someone a fool? Just name calling, Jesus says, is you're guilty of the fire of hell. And man, if that's not raising the bar, I don't know what is. He does the same thing with the idea of adultery. Great, you haven't gone and slept with someone who isn't your spouse. Congratulations. Well, I'm telling you that if you've ever thought about something like that, or you look at, he's picking on men here, I would suppose, you're looking at a woman with lustful intent. You're not doing what Job did, where he made a covenant with his eyes. You're not doing that. And by the way, Job did not have the phone software Covenant Eyes. He actually made a covenant with his eyes. He determined to say that he wasn't going to look lustfully at a woman. And Jesus is saying that if you have that temptation in your life, and you if you indulge in that temptation, then you're guilty of the same thing. It's the spirit of adultery that's in you, and it's problematic and no good. And at the end of the day, what Jesus is trying to explain is what holiness looks like, what righteousness looks like. And it looks like something beyond just finding out where the line is and then towing the line. That's not necessarily righteousness, because it goes down to deeper matters of the heart that we've got to understand. And that's really where this critique of divorce comes in. Like, Jesus is saying that what he wants out of human relationships, particularly marriage, he wants uncompromised faithfulness. And when we fail to practice or live out uncompromised faithfulness to our spouse, then we are, in fact, falling short of the glory of God, not living out holiness. And this is what happens when we sort of go the route of divorce, which in a fallen world where there is much brokenness and selfishness and rebellion and ignorance and all of those kind of things, where our hearts are not fully in tune with God, we tend to make decisions as we have to. And that's the reality of the human condition. The reality of the human condition is that marriage is a place where the brokenness of our humanity is showcased. And so many people end up just calling it quits and saying, I can no longer tolerate to be with you. And what Jesus is saying is that does not reflect holiness. It does not reflect what he is able to do. God remains faithful even when we are faithless. There's several Old Testament prophets that are given insight into this idea that even there was this experience where Israel played the harlot and prostituted themselves away from God, and yet God continued to come back and remain faithful to them. And that's the reality of what pure love and holiness really looks like. He kind of gets us off the hook a little bit and moves on with the idea of oaths. You know, can you keep your word? Can you say what you mean and mean what you say? Because you shouldn't have to reinforce it with promises and oaths. You should just let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, you should never make a mistake of saying something that you don't mean, or over-promising or under-promising. That's not holiness. It's not the way things should be. It's not right. And I think we all know how it feels when someone can't keep their word. It feels like that isn't right. And what Jesus is explaining is like, no, like God is going to keep his word. God has made promises to redeem. I'm the fulfillment of that promise, and you guys will never figure that out if you just keep focusing on you pulling this off. This is about my Father and I working a plan together to redeem you and the world. And so retaliation is just another one. You know, he brings up the Old Testament idea of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So, you know, if someone harms you, you get to, they should pay back, and it should be equal to that offense. And he's saying, you know, I'm giving you another way to live. Instead of making people pay for their sins, you should just absorb that wrath into your own self and actually sacrificially offer more to those people. It sounds a lot like what Jesus does for us. I mean, that's what holiness, like at the end of the day, each one of these things that Jesus is actually laying out as higher expectations of holiness actually serve as sort of an angle into the gospel itself. Because this is what God does for us. Here we are, enemies of God, making demands of him, taking advantage of him. And what does he do for us? He fundamentally turns his cheek, and he would let us take from him everything that we would demand and go the extra mile and not refuse. This is sort of a picture of what Christ has done for us. And Jesus is explaining, like, if you really want to know what holiness and righteousness looks like, it looks deeper and wider than what the Pharisees and scribes have been practicing. And it looks like an incredible capacity to show love for others with an abundant amount of grace and mercy. And this is exactly the kind of love that God has for us and that God practices for us and what God showcases for us in the gospel. And we kind of end this review of this passage with the idea of loving your enemies. You know, with the law said to love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but Jesus is saying, no, I'm actually saying love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same thing? See, that's called conditional love. It's the most normal kind of love, the most common experience. As long as you're nice to me, it's easy for me to be nice to you. The moment you start being a pain, it becomes really challenging for me to love you. But Jesus is saying, like, no. Look, perfect love lays down life for those who are not deserving of life. God shows love to the people who despise him and treat him like dirt. And that is the most pure kind of love that there is. And if we're going to sort of have an awareness of what living out in righteousness and holiness, what does it look like to live with righteousness and holiness? Well, Jesus is saying, like, well, the scribes and Pharisees have been given it their best shot, but, you know, it's actually much deeper than this. And he's using these concepts in Matthew 5, and we're looking at verse 21 through 48 to help us think through the reality of what real righteousness and holiness looks like. And ultimately, it's only something that God pulls off. And as God pulls that off for us in the gospel, and as we sort of become more fully aware of what God is up to, we begin to increase in our capacity to engage others in the same way, to sort of begin to understand that what God has done for us is be self-sacrificing and just abundantly generous and unconditional in his love. And so as we receive that experience of the gospel in our lives through Christ, it begins to shape and mold the way in which we engage with others. No longer just saying, like, well, what's the rule? And can I pat myself on the back because I kind of didn't break the rule today outwardly, when in reality what we realize is there's a lot going on the inside that really looks messy and broken. And the more we realize that God has come for those who are sick, like me, and has done everything necessary to restore me and bring me to health, giving me his righteousness, the more I'm freed up to no longer watch myself according to the law in an old way, but maybe now in a new way, in a spiritual way, to kind of just ask the question, man, what is the most loving thing I could do here in this situation? All right, well, that's 15 minutes, and my hope is that this continues to challenge you. Man, it's a boat rocker for sure. Definitely one of those kind of things that if you're sensitive in any way on any of these issues, you might kind of walk away a little hurt, but that's okay because God's love and grace and mercy are there to catch us as we fall in that experience and build us back up. So let that be an encouragement as you head into group or continue to just process this passage in light of what we looked at together this past Sunday. All right, take care, guys. Thanks for listening.